Hey folks, as promised, a little video about the 1990s and combat sports, what it was like back then. I started competing in the early 1990s, and I did at first something that you might best understand as Kyokushinkai rules. So striking to the body allowed, not to the head. Stupid rule, but it was what it was. Kicking allowed pretty much anywhere that is legal now in combat sports. Sometimes knee strikes to the body allowed, sometimes not. Clinching was allowed, sometimes adding knee strikes, sometimes not. And clinching and throwing was perfectly allowed in most cases. The Typically it was either bare knuckle, or you had this kind of like the cloth, not even glove, but just this little cloth thing that you have over your knuckles to protect them. That didn't give any stability or anything, but that was what you got. It was what it was. It wasn't great. It wasn't the worst thing. I did a point fighting tournament once. Hated it. I knocked out my first opponent by accident. We started, and I do a lead roundhouse kick to the face. Just slapped him in the face. I didn't think it was all that hard, but he snapped his head back a little bit, looked at me with a dazed looks, like what's going on here. So, and the referees, they were fine with it, and then there is starters up again, and I'm like, okay, let's try that again. I do the same kick. The guy just goes rigid, and he just falls like a plank to the side, smacks his skull on the floor, and I was like, holy crap. I didn't hit all that hard. I hit fast, but it wasn't all that hard. I think that guy was just so nervous that he was very susceptible to getting knocked out. But that was the first and last time that I did light contact is what we called it, point sparring. Never did it again. It was not for me. And then I competed so a lot in that kind of all style format is what we called it, because again, striking to the body, kicking pretty much all over, sometimes knees, sometimes not. No groundwork, but throws were allowed. And we had a lot of competitions here and tournaments in which people from karate, kung fu, kickboxing, taekwondo, anybody could just join and compete there with that rule set. I enjoyed that, but eventually got into Sanshou, or Standa, as it's sometimes called, which is Chinese kickboxing, and that is striking to the face allowed. At first limited. When I started, it was you could only do a 1-2 to the head punching, and then you had to do something else first. And they were very strict and annoying about it, and that goes towards all the bullshit that IWF, the International Wushu Federation, did with the rules. But I'm not going to rant about that. Did that for a while. I was frankly, I was above average, but that was about it. I came as a fighter from a small country. Belgium is a small country. There weren't a lot of people competing here as well. At first, there was no Sanshou competitions at all. So when I joined the national team, there was no Sanshou competitions. There was only the competitions with no striking to the head allowed. And what you did there qualified you to join the team, and then you could go to Sanshou, and there in the international competitions, you could strike to the head. So which makes zero sense. To like you have to win a badminton tournament, and then you can enter the national tennis team. That's the kind of logic behind it. And when I became national coach years later, I fought really hard to get the federation in Belgium to actually start organizing Sanshou tournaments at a national level. How the hell do you want to promote the sport and make it bigger if there's no events, if nobody can compete in it? Didn't make any sense to me then, still doesn't. Don't get me started about the federation. I eventually left when there was a lot of political bullshit, and somebody wanted my job as a national trainer. And when I found out about it, because a bunch of people said, Bim, they're going to stab you in the back. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to wait. I'll resign, and they can have my job, and I'll move on to other things. I don't need this nonsense in my life, in particular because it didn't pay. Quite on the contrary. Every time I competed abroad, the federation paid like half the travel costs, and you had to pay the other half. That was going to places like China, Malaysia, Russia, and so on. So quite expensive for a young guy with not a huge income. So it was a very different time than it was back then, than it is now. So I did that for a while. Like I said, became national coach, stopped with that, and then eventually switched to MMA when I saw that Sancho was going nowhere. The International Wushu Federation made a lot of decisions that I was like, I don't think this is a good idea. It's not going to go anywhere. And I just like, okay, I'm done. And then all the politics at a Belgian level, I'm like, I have absolutely no patience anymore for this. It's been decades that I've been, working here in this federation, and nothing changes. I'm out. Some people disagree with me on that. They're entitled to their opinion, but I'm out. So that is my personal journey. And just to finish it, so I switched to MMA. I'd been doing shoot fighting and some other stuff, but first in a private group that had a bunch of people, and then afterwards with in a much smaller group with a guy who had some experience, and then afterwards on and off with a bunch of people. As the kind of groups, these informal groups, they come and they go typically when people have priorities that change. But that was a good time. That was fun. What was it like back then? I started getting interested in combat sports in the 80s. And back then there was what we called American kickboxing, which is punching to the face allowed, kicking allowed only above the waist. Supposedly leg sweeps were allowed, but they were very quickly, refs would get upset and call it a leg kick when it was clearly a sweep. So I saw a bunch of those fights. There was like, ref, what the hell are you saying? I did that. I trained that a little bit with one of the students of Dominique Valera. And I'm sorry to say that I forgot his name. A little while. I was fairly flexible for a heavyweight, so I enjoyed that. But eventually, I went to Muay Thai and kickboxing gyms, and that was mostly available here. And I remember back in the day, and again, pre-internet time, so no internet, no YouTube, didn't exist, no websites. All your information came from mostly magazines and VHS tapes that you had to buy, which was quite expensive sometimes. I would read Zendokan, which was a Dutch martial arts magazine, and Karate Bushido, which was a French, which I think still exists. And they had like a big segment of each mag would be about martial arts in general, self-defense and so on. And the second part would be about combat sports. And so that's how we got to know a lot of the champions, what happened in the fights. And then months later, you could, if you were lucky, you could buy the VHS tape that had those fights. I still have some of those VHS tapes left. I gave away a bunch of them, but I still have some of them left from that era. I hope they still work. They might have rotten away. Film might have disintegrated, but that's how we got to see fights. Every now and then there was something on TV, very rarely, but usually you had to buy it. Early on, I bought Ben Urquidez, his instructional videotapes. They were okay, but I had to adapt them to Sancho rules because he fought on the different rules. Same thing with Rob Kaman, who would have put out a really good instructional video set, and that was very useful as well, but also had to adapt it to Sancho rules. And that's basically the thing. I mean, I didn't have a trainer, a coach, because again, almost nobody could fight in Sancho in Belgium because there was no national level tournaments. The federation didn't have them. So and that put me on my path to always just work with techniques, study them, try to understand them, what applies to me, how can I change them, when can I not change them, when does it break down if you change too much, which to this day is very much what informs me as an instructor and as a student, is that you can just change things to fit them into whatever you want to do with them. It doesn't mean it's a good idea or that it will work 100%. So that's what I did. And back then the biggest thing is that there was this evolution. For decades on end before that era, like in the 50s, 60s and so on, in the, let's say, the public subconscious, how people would view fighting, whether it's mostly social conflict or just whatever kind of competitive fighting, the paradigm would be boxing, striking with the fists, because that's what you thought a fighter was. Bit by bit, Japanese martial arts, karate, judo, kung fu, eventually in the 70s came along and challenged that a little bit, but not all that much in my opinion. mostly here in Europe, and as far as I can tell, in the US, that was also most of the case. I'm oversimplifying, but bear with me. And then bit by bit, what happened is that it turned into the challenge came from kickboxing, because the mindset was, well, these guys can box too, just like you boxers, but we can also kick you really really hard. And that was American style kickboxing. So, which is how we called it, is just kickboxing above the waistline only, no leg kicks allowed. Um, that started changing things a little bit, and then a few years later, it was kickboxing European style with leg kicks. And I very much remember reading interviews with American kickboxers in the day, and they were like, "Yeah, but the leg kick is not really that an efficient technique, and we'll just use a side kick and kick over the guy's leg kick, and hit him like that, and keep him at a distance." And there were many European champions American champions who came to Europe to fight under European kickboxing rules and got their asses beat. And again, I was there. I remember that a lot of them just they tried to do the sidekick thing, didn't work. It got blocked and parried out of the way, and they got a really really hard leg kick in return. A lot of them just couldn't walk anymore after the fight. There's a famous fight in I think it was in LA with Rick Rufus, who was like a really big name back then in American style kickboxing, fighting Kjartsongtit, if I'm not mistaken, where the Thai guy just basically chopped his legs off. I mean, Rufus broke his jaw and fought really well, but the Thai fighter just leg kicked him to death, and eventually he just ragdolled him with each kick. And for a lot of people, that was eye-opening. And that is a huge change. This is something I still try to explain to people when I talk about Randy's law, which is the differences are just as important as the similarities. Is that there was one change, one fundamental change in the rules of a combat sport, and everything needed to change in how you fought. All of a sudden, kicks below the waist were allowed, only the leg kick. You couldn't kick to the groin, couldn't kick to the knee, but leg kicks were allowed. You could still do all your high kicks if you wanted, but the other guy could kick your legs. And it changed fundamentally how you had to fight. The same thing happened when Muay Thai became popular in the late 80s and then in the 90s. Is that all of a sudden the kickboxers found out that they didn't know how to clinch with such a guy. They didn't know how to use elbows and knees, and they got beat up. A lot of the Dutch and French guys went to Thailand to fight and to compete, and they got basically beaten to a pulp. Okay, not every one of them, but they never won, and they got beat up bad in many cases. So they started learning, and you've got Kenji Kurosaki, which is the coach who was, if I'm not mistaken, the guy to first train a non-Thai who would win in, I think, Lumpini champion, the Toshio Fujiwara, who was one of his students who went to the Thais and fought under their rules, used a lot of footwork and movement, and actually won the title. It was a long time ago. I think that must be, I think in the early 80s. I'm not sure anymore. So that was a paradigm shift as well, is that you had to learn how to fight like the Thais. But then there became this European style of Muay Thai and kickboxing, which blended a lot of the aspects that we already had with kickboxing and with Western boxing, with local training methodologies, and then try to figure out how we could make all that work with the Muay Thai rules as they were in Thailand. To this day, this persists. And what does that mean? They sometimes call it the Dutch method or the French method, because the French always also did that. It's that, remember the context. In Thailand, if you're a fighter, you can fight every week, more or less. So at a very young age, you start fighting. Just like over here in Europe, soccer games, you can have a soccer match every weekend if you want, if you're young. And so you develop a lot of experience and a lot of technique very quickly. Whereas here we had adults who came from different martial arts, starting to do kickboxing or Muay Thai, and were already adults, and then went to Thailand and got their asses beat by guys who were just doing that from waiting for the truck to pass. They were doing that from the moment they were basically able to walk. We didn't have a lot of events, a lot of Muay Thai events here in Europe back in the day. at best maybe once a month or a little bit later. So that meant that you couldn't have a lot of fighting experience because you weren't on that event every month. Even if there's one a month, you as a fighter were not on there. There were a bunch of other fighters, so you could fight maybe 2-3 times a year if you were lucky, really in the beginning. So what happened is that there was a lot of sparring over here, hard sparring. You would fight in the gym. You do wars in the gym. Glove up, big gloves, shin guards, go at it. That was what training was like. And I remember back then when I trained in some Muay Thai gyms, that was how it was. Just you would fight wars in the gym. I don't think it's smart training, but that was how you got experience because you couldn't compete as much. Eventually, what we have now is there's a lot more. There were a lot more events, but still not to the level of like in Thailand, where it's like almost every day you can go watch a match if you want. So the method of training was contextual to European the European competitive scene, which was so small that you had to find another way and get experience another way, which meant training way too hard in the gym. There were, especially in the 90s, we had a lot of events that were set up so that some, Thai champions would come to Europe, to the Netherlands mostly, and France, where they would compete against European champions and often beat them. But bit by bit, that started, equalizing. We had guys like Ramon Dekkers, Rob Kaman, Ernesto Hoost, all these guys, and then a bunch of guys in France as well, who were basically always, doing really well, and bit by bit, just the level of skill went up, and to the point where Ramon Dekkers was one of the first who was recognized by the king in Thailand, and the story goes, and I've seen a lot of people who confirmed it, that he would just show up at the airport and they just wave him through. The guys at who checked the passports, because they knew who he was. Like, okay, you can come on through, and he was recognized as one of the guys who fought like a Thai. So that started happening in the 90s, and like then we had the introduction from MMA, and basically the same thing happened. Is that bit by bit how people view violence changed toward MMA. Now you see guys who have no training going for double leg takedowns, trying to do ground and pound and so on. That didn't happen like 30-40 years ago, or not like it does now. The reason why a lot of my views on combat sports and martial arts are what they are is because I saw that evolution multiple times. Again, when I started, it was like, you don't want to fight a boxer. These guys they will mess you up. And then like a few years later, it's like, yeah, but just kickboxers, they're really bad. And then a few years later, it's like, yeah, but those Thai fighters, they're really, really horrible to fight because they can knee you and they can do this and that. And then it became MMA. So what will be the next thing? We'll see. But the point is that if you see that evolution, you have a different mindset and a different view on things than people who never saw the evolution like that, who only grew up in a certain time period. If you're in your 20s now, MMA is pretty much the only thing you really saw becoming popular. So that's basically it. I'm gonna wrap up because it's almost 20 minutes now, and I wanted to keep it a little bit shorter. Different times, different training methods. I very much enjoyed competing back then. Specifically the training for the competition. Competition sometimes less so, because it was a lot of waiting around all day. That was the biggest thing that I hated. Again, like I said, I was okay. I was above average for my country, but I was by far not the best guy in the world, by far. There were a lot of guys who were so much better than me. But I think with what I had available to me, as far as coaching and so on, I did the best I could. I learned a lot. And that's what I try to pass on now to my MMA students, is like some of the stuff that I learned. And in particular, this mindset of always trying to learn more and figure out better ways to do things and experiment, that stuck with me. And like I said, back then, there was not a lot of information, no internet, no YouTube, nothing. So you had to figure things out and steal stuff left and right from other arts, try to incorporate it into your fighting style. throw out a bunch of stuff that didn't work, or and sometimes figure out like, okay, this jump spinning back kick from Taekwondo actually does work. So that's basically what it was. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this trip into memory lane. Talk to you next time. Bye.